Above the endless blue of the Pacific, a lone Japanese Zero tore through the clouds, the hum of its engine slicing the morning air. Below, the American fleet gleamed like a city of steel, its decks alive with motion, catapults primed and sailors bracing for the inevitable. The Zero dove with lethal precision, wings trembling under the strain of speed and maneuvers that once guaranteed dominance over the skies. But this time, the rules had changed. A wall of anti-aircraft fire erupted, tracer rounds arcing like molten lightning, tearing at the sky where the Zero cut through. From the shadows above, F6F Hellcats and F4F Wildcats surged upward, engines roaring, wings weaving in tight defensive patterns. Every maneuver designed to crush the predatory bird of Japan's once feared air armada. The air was thick with smoke, the acrid sting of cordite, and the sharp metallic scent of burning fuel. Every second stretched into an eternity, every movement a life or death gamble. Once, Japanese pilots had ruled these skies with unmatched skill and audacity. Their reputation was legendary. A pilot could dive, twist, and vanish almost at will, leaving enemies scrambling in awe and terror. But the Pacific of 1944-45 was no longer the familiar arena of dogfights and tactical cunning. The Americans had learned, adapted, and transformed. Their carriers were floating fortresses, packed with endless firepower and layers of defense that no single fighter could pierce alone. From the decks below, endless waves of aircraft launched in relentless succession. Torpedo bombers, dive bombers, fighters, each formation a calculated instrument of destruction. Every angle had been anticipated, every weak point covered. The hunter had become the hunted. The Zero wavered mid-dive, engines screaming, pilot's heart hammering, aware that this sortie could be his last. And yet, in that split second above the vast indifferent ocean, the question lingered: how had the tide turned so decisively? What had shifted the balance so thoroughly that the sky, once dominated by these masters of the air, now became a death trap? The answer was waiting below, in the decks, the guns, and the meticulous strategy of the American carriers, floating steel cities armed with an unyielding, almost endless firepower. For the Zero above, survival was no longer a matter of skill alone. What changed? The question hung over the water like smoke from burning fuel. The answer was floating steel cities, armed with endless firepower. December 7, 1941. The sun rose over Pearl Harbor, casting golden light across a harbor that would soon be transformed into a scene of chaos and fire. Japanese pilots, trained to perfection and flying the legendary Mitsubishi A6M0, descended like shadows from the sky. In minutes, battleships burned, airfields were obliterated, and the world witnessed a new dimension of war. Carrier-based aviation unleashed with surgical precision. The Japanese had struck fear into the hearts of the Allies, demonstrating a terrifying combination of surprise, skill, and technological edge. The Zero was not just a plane, it was an extension of the pilot, a machine of unmatched agility and grace. Its light frame allowed it to twist, climb, and dive in ways Allied aircraft could not match. In dogfights, it was lethal, a predator with speed, maneuverability, and the daring of its elite pilots behind the controls. These were men trained to endure exhaustion, to anticipate enemy movements, to exploit the smallest opening in formation or defense. Their doctrine emphasized initiative, deception, and audacity. In the early years of the war, it worked perfectly. From the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies, from Wake Island to Malaya, Japanese carriers struck with devastating efficiency. Entire Allied fleets were forced to retreat or face annihilation. The concept of naval air power, still nascent in Western minds, was perfected by Japan. Carriers became floating fortresses, capable of projecting lethal force across hundreds of miles of open ocean. The Zero gave that force wings, and the pilots, with near superhuman skill, became myths in motion. At first, the Allies were terrified. American and British pilots were scrambling, unprepared for an enemy who could appear out of thin air, strike with deadly precision, and vanish before retaliation. Air doctrine, tactics, and even the psychology of war itself had to evolve to face this new threat. Every encounter was a harsh lesson, every loss a grim reminder of the Zero's superiority. For the first 18 months of the war, Japanese dominance in the air seemed absolute. The success was not accidental. Japanese doctrine combined surprise attacks, disciplined formations, and rigorous pilot training. The emphasis was not just on flying skill, but on thinking like a predator, anticipating, exploiting, and striking without hesitation. Carriers were coordinated with precision, their aircraft operating as extensions of a single ruthless strategy. Fuel, munitions, and timing were calculated to near perfection. Each mission was a symphony of violence and efficiency, yet even at its peak, this dominance contained a fragile truth. The Zero was light, stripped of armor to maximize maneuverability, and highly dependent on the skill of the pilot. Its advantage lay not in raw firepower, but in exploiting surprise, speed, and superior technique. Once confronted by numbers, tactics, and technological countermeasures, the edge would narrow, and eventually it would vanish. By late 1942, cracks began to appear. Allied designers studied the Zero obsessively, crafting planes that could withstand its attacks. Tactics evolved. Energy fighting, diving attacks, and coordinated formations aimed to counter the nimble predator. The aura of invincibility that had surrounded Japanese pilots began to fade, even if the psychological impact of their early victories lingered in Allied memory. And yet, in 1941-42, their dominance was undeniable. The Pacific was a theater ruled by Japanese skill, daring, and innovation. The Zero was more than a plane. It was a symbol of a generation of pilots who mastered the sky. For a brief, terrifying moment, it seemed that no force could match them, but mastery is never permanent. The hunter can become the hunted, and in the vast reaches of the Pacific, the seeds of a shift were already being sown. One that would make the floating steel cities of America the ultimate arbiter of survival in the skies, while Japanese pilots perfected their deadly dance in the skies across the Pacific. American strategists were laying the groundwork for a gamble that could change the course of the war. The United States did not seek to match the Zero in dogfighting finesse or the skill of elite pilots. Instead, the plan was audacious: outproduce, outscale, and overwhelm the enemy. In the crucible of late 1941, American leaders bet that sheer industrial might, applied with intelligence and innovation, could transform the tide of war. At the heart of this strategy were the aircraft carriers, floating airfields capable of projecting power far beyond the reach of traditional naval artillery. The doctrine was revolutionary and risky. These mobile islands had no inherent armor like battleships, yet their ability to launch waves of aircraft made them far more lethal than any stationary fort or gun turret. Every deck, every catapult, every hangar was a piece of a living, breathing weapon system, designed to strike swiftly and vanish before the enemy could respond. Ships like the USS Enterprise, USS Yorktown, and USS Hornet became icons of this new naval age. Their names were whispered with respect and fear across both Allied and Axis command rooms. Each carrier carried hundreds of aircraft, fueled by the promise that mobility, speed, and coordination could compensate for vulnerability. In their steel hulls and wooden flight decks, America placed its bets. The war could be won, not by brute force alone, but by vision, calculation, and flexibility. This shift was more than technological. It was doctrinal. Battleships, long revered as the kings of the sea, were suddenly vulnerable to air attacks launched from hundreds of miles away. The mighty guns of old could no longer dictate the terms of naval engagement. In their place, squadrons of dive bombers and fighters could strike with precision, disappearing before retaliation. Victory depended on coordination, timing, and the ability to maintain an unbroken cycle of attack and defense. Yet the gamble was perilous. A single mistake, a miscalculated launch, a failure in reconnaissance, or a lucky strike by the enemy could sink these floating fortresses and turn the strategy into disaster. Every sailor, every pilot understood the stakes. Their lives were tethered to fragile decks that carried the hopes of a nation across thousands of miles of ocean. By 1942, the fruits of this gamble began to show. Carriers like the Enterprise and Hornet were no longer just tools of war. They were symbols of American resilience, ingenuity, and industrial might. Where the Japanese had relied on elite skill and tactical surprise, the Americans had created a system that could absorb losses, adapt, and strike back with relentless force. The carriers were not invincible, but their mobility made them lethal, their presence decisive, and their potential unmatched. And yet, for every wave launched from these floating airfields, the Japanese pilots remained a deadly shadow overhead. The Pacific was becoming a chessboard of steel, fire, and strategy, where each move carried consequences measured in lives, ships, and territory. The question remained, could America's industrial gamble withstand the ferocity of a sky once ruled by the Zeros? The answer, as the next battle would reveal, would not just be about planes and steel, but about adaptation, resilience, and the unforgiving calculus of war. June 4th, 1942. The Pacific dawn was deceptively calm. The horizon painted in shades of gold and indigo, as if the world itself were holding its breath. In the vast expanse of open ocean, the fate of the Japanese fleet and the balance of power in the Pacific would be decided in a single, catastrophic day. Midway. A name that would echo through history, a crucible of strategy, skill, and sheer luck. Japanese commanders approached Midway with the confidence of invincibility. 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, teamed with supporting battleships and cruisers, their air groups brimming with the famed Mitsubishi Zeros, dive bombers, and torpedo planes that had seemed unstoppable in 1941. The plan was bold: lure the remaining American carriers into a trap and annihilate them, securing total control of the Central Pacific. For the pilots, it was another mission in a war they believed they could dominate, but the Americans had read the plan. Naval intelligence had cracked Japanese codes, uncovering the trap before it could spring. Admiral Chester Nimitz and his team orchestrated a counter-ambush, positioning the carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown in secret, ready to strike with precision. For the Japanese, the morning would begin with the assumption of superiority and end with shock. At first, the battle unfolded as expected. Japanese air groups found Midway's defenses and the small garrison struggling to respond. Bombs fell, fires erupted, and the atoll's limited forces fought bravely but were outmatched. Then, as the Japanese planes began to circle back to the carriers, the American strike groups arrived. Dive bombers descended from the sun, unseen until the final seconds, and in moments the tide turned. Flames engulfed the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. Explosions tore through decks, pilots scrambled in vain, and the myth of invincibility began to crumble. In the sky, Japanese pilots who had once moved with confidence and precision now faced an unimaginable reality. Their carriers, the lifeblood of their doctrine, were burning. Zeros maneuvered desperately to cover retreating bombers, but the scale of loss was overwhelming. For every maneuver perfected over years of training, there was now a relentless, coordinated response from the Americans. Ambition collided with the harsh calculus of war. By the end of the day, 4 Japanese carriers were destroyed. Thousands of lives were lost in an instant, and with them, a psychological dominance that had seemed unshakable. The Japanese fleet, once the apex predator of the Pacific, had been humbled. Confidence fractured, and the aura of invincibility evaporated in smoke and flame. Pilots returned to base, faces grim, hearts heavy with the knowledge that nothing in war was permanent, not skill, not strategy, not pride. Yet the battle did not end with Midway. It was a turning point, yes, but only the beginning of a broader shift. The Americans had proven that intelligence, preparation, and industrial capacity could match and even exceed elite skill. The carriers, once untested in full-scale fleet combat, had proven decisive. The psychological landscape of the Pacific had shifted. Japanese pilots now faced an enemy capable of anticipating, adapting, and striking with devastating effectiveness as the smoke cleared over the burning decks and the ocean reclaimed shattered aircraft. A new reality settled over the Pacific. The Japanese would continue to fight fiercely, but their confidence would never again be absolute. For the Americans, the lesson was clear. Control of the sea required innovation, courage, and a willingness to gamble everything on mobility and coordination. And for the Japanese pilots above, watching their floating fortresses burn, the question lingered in the roar of engines and the acrid scent of smoke. How could the hunters survive when the hunter had become the hunted? This was only the beginning. By 1943, the Pacific had become a theater not just of skill and tactics, but of raw industrial might. Japan, still reeling from Midway and subsequent losses, could produce only a handful of carriers and a limited number of aircraft. Their elite pilots flew relentlessly, but attrition was unforgiving. Every plane loss was a blow not easily replaced, every experienced pilot irreplaceable. In contrast, America had embarked on a war effort on a scale the world had never seen, from shipyards stretching across the coasts to factories humming with tireless labor. The United States launched carriers in unprecedented numbers. Escort carriers, smaller and more nimble, multiplied the reach of fleets, while Essex-class supercarriers emerged as floating fortresses capable of sustaining relentless waves of aircraft. The decks of these carriers became assembly lines of lethal precision, each plane a cog in a system designed for overwhelming firepower. Where Japan could send 1 or 2 dozen aircraft, America could launch hundreds, a constant tide of wings and engines over the horizon. The aircraft themselves reflected the evolution of strategy. F6F Hellcats, F4U Corsairs, and TBM Avengers were not merely planes. They were instruments of industrial ingenuity. Designed for survivability, firepower, and adaptability, they could take hits, return to carrier decks, and launch again. Pilots joked bitterly that the real advantage was almost absurd. We had more planes than they had fuel. And in many ways, it was true. The American pipeline of aircraft was relentless, a living demonstration of logistics and production applied directly to the calculus of war. This industrial superiority was not just about numbers, it was about sustainability. Japanese carriers, once the apex predators of the Pacific, struggled to keep aircraft and trained pilots in the air. Every loss diminished morale and capability. The Americans, by contrast, could replace losses almost as quickly as they occurred, maintaining pressure across multiple fronts. Attrition, a concept that had once favored the highly trained Japanese airmen, now worked in favor of the United States. The psychological shift was profound. Confidence, once Japan's greatest weapon, became fragile under the relentless weight of American production. Carriers became the visible symbols of this industrial might. From the deck of an Essex-class supercarrier, hundreds of aircraft could launch, recover, refuel, and strike again, a cycle of destruction that the Japanese could no longer match. Each plane was a testament to preparation, planning, and the capacity to think beyond immediate victory. Strategy was no longer measured solely by skill or daring, but by the ability to sustain combat power indefinitely. By late 1944, as the war approached its final stages, the imbalance was clear. Japanese pilots, facing a shrinking pool of experienced comrades and aircraft, began to confront a reality their training had never prepared them for: numbers, coordination, and relentless adaptation. could overpower even the most skilled airmen. The Pacific, once a domain where the Zero ruled unchallenged, had become a vast arena where industrial capacity, tactical innovation, and sheer perseverance dictated survival. And yet, even amidst this crushing imbalance, the courage of Japanese pilots remained undeniable. They fought with skill, audacity, and a deep sense of honor, even as the tide turned inexorably against them. The narrative of the Pacific War was no longer just about air combat, but about the collision of human skill and industrial might, the relentless march of machines and strategy against the backdrop of the endless ocean. In this battle of factories, carriers, and aircraft, the lesson became stark. In modern warfare, victory belonged not only to those who fought, but to those who could outthink, outbuild, and outlast the enemy. The Pacific was vast, but America's industrial heart ensured it would dominate every corner. And yet, the final reckoning was still to come, as the Japanese pilots who had once ruled the skies would discover in the closing campaigns of 1944-45. By late 1944, the skies over the Pacific had changed almost beyond recognition. Japanese pilots, once masters of dogfights and ambush, now faced a new adversary designed not to match skill alone, but to exploit every weakness in the vaunted Zero. The F6F Hellcat was the embodiment of this evolution. Rugged, fast, and heavily armed, it was built to survive, strike, and return to the deck of its carrier. The first encounters were shocking. Zeros, trained to dominate, found themselves outgunned and outpaced. The Hellcat could climb faster, dive harder, and absorb punishment that would have shattered the delicate Japanese fighter. Its 650 caliber machine guns roared with devastating firepower, capable of downing agile aircraft in seconds. Pilots who had once danced confidently against inferior planes now faced a machine that turned their speed and maneuverability into vulnerabilities. The statistics were staggering. By the end of the war, Hellcats had accounted for nearly 13,000 Japanese aircraft, often at odds of 5 to 1. Each kill was not just a number, it represented a fracture in the psychological dominance the Japanese had once wielded so effortlessly. Confidence, skill, and tradition could no longer guarantee survival in a sky increasingly dominated by overwhelming firepower and rugged engineering. Japanese pilots, who had once mocked American planes for their perceived clumsiness, now had a grudging respect. The Hellcat earned a nickname among them, the Ace Maker. It was a machine that transformed ordinary pilots into deadly opponents, leveling the playing field in a conflict where attrition, production, and technological adaptation were becoming decisive. Where once elite skill was everything, now it was matched and exceeded by tactical innovation and industrial might. Combat reports from late 1944 reveal a grim reality. Japanese formations were increasingly fragmented, tactics that once ensured dominance were failing, and morale was eroding under the relentless pressure of Hellcat patrols. Pilots who had survived multiple sorties were haunted by the sheer scale of American presence in the sky. The days of solitary heroism, of individual pilots turning the tide of battle, were ending. Air superiority demanded coordination, numbers, and machines built to endure. Yet even as the balance shifted, the courage and ingenuity of Japanese pilots remained remarkable. They adapted where possible, exploiting terrain, sun angles, and surprise attacks, clinging to the remnants of the doctrine that had once made them unstoppable. But each encounter was a stark reminder the Pacific was no longer theirs to command. The Zero, elegant and deadly in earlier years, had become increasingly vulnerable against aircraft designed to exploit its weaknesses. The contrast was clear. On one side, the Japanese relied on history, training, and individual skill. On the other, the Americans relied on rugged aircraft, endless replacements, and an evolving doctrine that prioritized sustainability and coordinated firepower. The war in the air had shifted decisively. Survival was no longer simply a matter of courage. It was a matter of technology, numbers, and the ability to endure the relentless attrition of modern warfare. Above the vast Pacific, the psychological impact was profound. Japanese pilots faced the unthinkable, a sky where mastery no longer guaranteed survival, where their once feared fighters were now being methodically destroyed by an enemy they had underestimated. The ace makers of the United States had arrived, and the Zeros that once ruled the air were increasingly hunted, trapped above the endless blue, with nowhere to hide. The stage was set for the final campaigns, where firepower, strategy, and human endurance would converge in the closing months of the war. June 19th to 20, 1944. The skies over the Marianas erupted in fire, smoke, and the relentless roar of engines. Japanese commanders, desperate to blunt the American advance, launched massive waves of aircraft at the advancing U.S. fleet. Hundreds of Zeros, bombers, and torpedo planes roared toward the carriers, determined to turn the tide of the Pacific War. The pilots carried skill, courage, and the weight of a nation's expectations, but they were walking into a trap that would crush them. Below, the American carriers, spearheaded by the Essex-class giants, prepared to unleash a response that would become legend. Within minutes, waves of F6F Hellcats and F4U Corsairs ascended, their engines screaming and their wings bristling with firepower. From the deck to the sky, coordination was perfect, almost machine-like, each pilot knowing his role in a carefully orchestrated ballet of destruction. Anti-aircraft guns erupted in synchronized fury, tracers crisscrossing the sky, while the carriers themselves became the center of an invisible killing grid. For the Japanese pilots, the opening moments were disorienting. The first formations approached with confidence, expecting to overwhelm an American force that had, in past encounters, faltered under skilled attack. But the carriers were prepared, the fighters in place, the guns calibrated to perfection. Within minutes, the air became a storm of fire. Japanese planes were shredded mid-flight, torn apart by gunners and fighters alike. Pilots who had once prided themselves on agility and daring found themselves unable to penetrate the defenses, their numbers and skill insufficient, against a perfectly synchronized network of steel and firepower. The battle earned its grim nickname quickly, the Marianas Turkey Shoot. Pilots described it with a mix of awe and horror, as waves of enemy aircraft were cut down with devastating efficiency. In 2 days, Japanese losses exceeded 600 planes, aircraft that could never be replaced at the speed of American production, and pilots who were increasingly irreplaceable. For the first time, it was clear to all that Japan's Air Force, once feared across the Pacific, was dying in the skies of its own ambitions. The psychological impact was as severe as the physical destruction. Japanese pilots returned to base, hearts heavy with the knowledge that no matter their courage or skill, survival was no longer guaranteed. Every sortie risked total annihilation. Confidence shattered, morale frayed, and the carefully cultivated aura of invincibility evaporated in smoke and flame. In their own words, they faced a sky that was no longer theirs to command, a battlefield where human skill alone could no longer dictate the outcome. For the Americans, the Marianas operation reinforced a fundamental truth: air power, industrial might, and tactical coordination could achieve dominance in ways previously unimaginable. Carriers, once a gamble, had proven decisive. Aircraft could be replaced. Pilots could endure. The enemy could be crushed not only by bullets and bombs, but by the relentless momentum of a nation's production and strategy. By the end of those 2 days, the map of the Pacific was being redrawn. Japanese carriers and airfields were increasingly irrelevant. The theater was dominated by numbers, coordination, and technology. The Marianas Turkey Shoot was more than a battle. It was a signal, a turning point in the psychological and tactical war that would echo through the final campaigns. As one Japanese aviator later reflected, the words were stark, unflinching. Japan's Air Force died in the skies of the Marianas. The Pacific was no longer a playground for skill and daring alone. It had become a crucible of industrial scale, relentless adaptation, and the unforgiving calculus of modern warfare. And yet, the war was far from over. The pilots who survived, the carriers still afloat, and the endless push of American firepower would meet once more in the closing months, a relentless chase across the oceans that would determine not just control of territory, but the very survival of a nation's air arm. By early 1945, Japan's once feared air arm had been decimated. The elite pilots who had dominated the skies in 1941-42 were gone, replaced by inexperienced recruits, many still green and untested. Faced with overwhelming American firepower and an industrial machine that seemed unstoppable, Japanese commanders turned to a strategy born of desperation, the kamikaze. Suicide attacks, in which pilots would deliberately crash their planes into enemy ships, became a symbol of both courage and tragic futility. Carriers, the floating fortresses that had turned the Pacific into a deadly stage for American pilots, now became the prime targets. Waves of kamikazes streaked toward decks, planes aflame and engines screaming, intent on inflicting maximum damage. For the sailors and airmen aboard, the sight was terrifying. A human missile plunging from the sky, impossible to reason with, driven only by devotion and desperation. Anti-aircraft guns roared, fighters intercepted, and damage control teams worked tirelessly. But the relentless onslaught was unyielding. Yet, even as kamikazes struck with horrifying impact, the industrial imbalance remained decisive. American carriers, though damaged, were repaired quickly, often returning to battle faster than Japan could replace the planes or pilots lost in each attack. The sheer scale of production meant that ships sunk or damaged could be replaced, crews rotated, and aircraft launched with relentless efficiency. What was meant to terrorize became in many ways another layer of attrition that Japan could not sustain. Psychologically, the kamikaze program reflected the extent of Japan's desperation. Pilots who had once honed their skill to dominate the skies were replaced by recruits sent on one-way missions, a stark acknowledgement that traditional warfare could no longer turn the tide. Courage alone could not match industrial might, tactical innovation, or strategic depth. The kamikaze attacks were vivid, terrifying, and often effective in the short term, but in the broader calculus of war, they could not compensate for the imbalance in resources, production, or trained personnel. For the Americans, the strategy revealed just how dominant they had become. Every attack, every plane destroyed or diverted, was a reminder of the enemy's shrinking options. The carriers, protected by numbers, coordination, and innovation, could endure strikes that would have been catastrophic only years earlier. Each kamikaze plunged into a deck, only to be replaced by the next wave of American air power, a grim testament to the changing nature of the conflict. By February 1945, during operations such as Fruling's Wind, the kamikazes struck with courage, but with limited strategic effect. Their desperation illuminated the truth of Japan's position. The balance of power had shifted irreversibly. The sky, once the domain of elite pilots and daring maneuvers, had become a battlefield where attrition, industrial output, and tactical coordination reigned supreme. Skill alone was no longer enough to survive. And yet amid the smoke, fire, and sacrifice, one reality remained undeniable. The human dimension of war, the courage, resolve, and commitment of pilots, persisted even in the face of hopeless odds. The kamikazes embodied the extreme lengths a nation would go to resist overwhelming force. But in the end, the lesson was clear. Even extraordinary bravery could not overcome the relentless momentum of industrialized war, nor the floating steel cities that dominated the Pacific skies. March 1945. Across the Pacific, the war had become as much a psychological battlefield as a physical one. For American pilots, the carriers beneath them were more than steel and engines. They were assurance, lifelines that allowed daring maneuvers, calculated risks, and relentless assaults on enemy formations. "We always knew we had a deck to come home to," one pilot recalled. That knowledge infused every sortie with confidence, a stark contrast to the terror and uncertainty that had haunted aviators in the early years of the war. The deck was not just a landing strip. It was a promise of survival, a floating city of steel and ingenuity that embodied the industrial and strategic might of the United States. For the Japanese pilots who remained, memories were far darker. Those who survived the battles of the Marianas, the Philippines, and Iwo Jima carried images of endless swarms of American planes, the roar of engines and the flash of gunfire etching into their minds a landscape of despair. Training and skill, once the core of their confidence, seemed almost meaningless against the sheer scale of firepower arrayed against them. One veteran later reflected on the skies over the Pacific. The enemy was everywhere, relentless, and nearly impossible to escape. Pride had given way to a survival instinct that felt both desperate and inevitable. The emotional contrast between the two sides could not have been more stark. American pilots flew with the quiet assurance of preparation, logistics, and redundancy. Each wave of planes launched from their decks reinforced a sense of control over the battlefield. For Japanese pilots, every mission was a gamble against overwhelming odds, a test of courage in skies dominated by numbers, firepower, and coordination far beyond what any single individual could counter. This psychological dimension extended beyond the air. Sailors and crewmen on American carriers shared in the security that their floating fortresses provided. Damage could be repaired, pilots replaced, sorties renewed. Across the Pacific, it was a war that could be endured, adapted to, and ultimately won through persistence. For Japanese aviators, by contrast, each loss compounded the despair. Aircraft, pilots, and morale were finite, and the relentless American pressure made every mission increasingly perilous. The narratives intertwine with global context. While the Pacific was dominated by industrial might and technological evolution, the European theater mirrored the same lessons. In April 1945, as the Ruhr pocket collapsed, German forces faced encirclement, overwhelming numbers, and the brutal certainty of attrition. Across continents, the lesson was consistent. Preparation, adaptability, and resources could turn even the most skilled and determined forces into hunted survivors. Victory was no longer simply a measure of bravery. It was the synthesis of human endurance, innovation, and logistical superiority. Even in despair, Japanese pilots displayed courage that commands respect. Their skill, ingenuity, and willingness to confront near-impossible odds remain legendary. Yet the psychological reality of facing endless American aircraft, carriers that seemed invincible, and the inexorable tide of industrial output left few illusions. Pride, once a source of confidence, became a fragile veneer over fear and exhaustion. The human perspective, when distilled, reveals a central truth about war. Mastery, courage, and skill matter, but only when supported by infrastructure, resources, and strategy. The floating steel cities of the United States did not just project power. They transformed the psychology of battle, turning confidence into advantage and despair into inevitability. And as the war neared its conclusion, both sides carried the indelible mark of these experiences, one of resilience and triumph, the other of loss and unyielding courage in the face of insurmountable odds. The Pacific Ocean, once a theater dominated by skill, daring, and audacity, had been transformed by a new force, the aircraft carrier. These floating empires of steel reshaped naval warfare forever. Where battleships once ruled with thunderous guns, carriers projected power across hundreds of miles, turning the sky itself into the ultimate battlefield. Their decks were launch pads for strategy, innovation, and the relentless firepower of a nation willing to harness every resource in pursuit of victory. Japan's pilots, At the outset of the war, had seemed untouchable. Masters of the skies, they maneuvered with precision, courage, and skill that inspired awe and fear. Yet even the most elite aviators could not escape the inexorable reality of American industrial might. The floating steel cities of the United States, carriers bristling with fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes, served as both sanctuary and weapon, a combination of resilience, technology, and strategy that could absorb losses and strike again without hesitation. The story of the Pacific Air War is ultimately a story of adaptation, endurance, and the unforgiving calculus of modern conflict. Japanese skill met American preparation. Courage faced industrial output. Pride confronted coordination and firepower on a scale never before imagined. The result was a transformation of naval combat, a rewriting of the rules that elevated strategy and production to equal footing with individual heroism. As the smoke of WWII fades into history, the legacy of these floating steel cities is visible in the modern Navy. Cameras sweep over massive carriers, their decks alive with aircraft echoing the lessons of a conflict fought over vast oceans. These ships are heirs to the giants of the 1940s, monuments to the power of preparation, resilience, and the capacity to wield innovation decisively. For the pilots of Japan, the war was a crucible they could not survive indefinitely. For the United States, it was proof that a nation's vision, industrial strength, and tactical ingenuity could reshape the world. In the end, the Pacific Air War was not just about planes or carriers. It was about human endurance, the hidden strength of preparation, and the enduring truth that mastery must meet adaptability to survive. The floating empire of firepower remains, a testament to the triumph of strategy, innovation, and relentless human determination. And above the vast ocean, the lesson endures. Skill alone is never enough. Survival and victory demand vision, preparation, and the courage to wield every advantage the world provides.